Hey, good morning. Good day to you, friends. Seamus here. I hope you're all well today. Thank you for joining me today for something that is short and sweet and silly, and I hope you enjoy it. This is a very lighthearted take on a classic tale by Hans Christian Andersen. I do want to take a moment to thank all you kind folk that have liked our videos in the past, shared them out on social media. I appreciate the subscriptions and the little bell ringing thing. To those of you that have bought coffee, we thank you for that, and if you want to, the link's down below. But let's just get right into it. This is a very lighthearted take on a legendary old tale by Hans Christian Andersen. It is the story of the Princess and the Pea. So let's just go ahead and get right to it. Once upon a time, many years ago, there was a handsome prince. And he had a very good life, as one would expect. I mean, he lived in a castle. His mom and dad were the king and queen. I mean, he rode the best horses, wore the best clothes, ate the best food. His life was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. The only thing that would have made it better. See, you thought I was going to say the only thing that would make it more wonderful. But the only thing that would make it more better was if he had somebody to share his life with. If he had a lovely princess by his side, that could be just about the only thing that would make him even happier than he had always been. So one early spring day, he had spoken with his parents over the course of several weeks, and the arrangements had all been made, and he decided to set off on a quest. He was going to visit every single visiting kingdom, neighboring kingdom, every kingdom that was close by. He was going to meet every princess that he possibly could, and he was going to find himself someone to share his life with. And off he went that spring with a small retinue, a few guards, a few servants, and off he went. And he traveled and he traveled and he traveled for many days and weeks, and he went from kingdom to neighborhood, and he met just about every princess that there was to meet. There was a few that were away on missions of mercy, and there was a few that were away at school, imagine that, and there were a few that just weren't available, but that doesn't matter. He met a whole lot of princesses. But it seemed no matter what happened, they weren't all quite what he was looking for. Some were beautiful on the outside, but not so beautiful on the inside. Some were very sarcastic, and he didn't like that. Some were very strong-willed, which was wonderful, but not for a prince. And it went on and on. And anyway, after several months of journeying, he made his way home quite disappointed because he had not found a princess to share his life with. Soon after he got home, and it would have been in the early autumn, of course, that's the time of change between the summer and the autumn, and he got home, and sure enough, the weather started to change. And one night, soon after he got home, just as the sun was setting, a horrific storm rolled in. A storm like no one had ever known before. Oh, and the lightning flashed like it was the noonday sun, and the thunder rumbled down from the mountains and shook the very foundations of the castle, and the rain came down in such a deluge it was like rivers falling from the sky. But inside the castle, no one cared. The prince sat with his mother and father, the queen and the king, and they were having a cozy dinner close to the fireplace, and the servants were happy, and they had a dry roof over their head, and all was well, and who really cared what happened outside the castle, or so it seemed. And then just as they were finishing their dinner and having their last little sip of wine, unexpectedly at the gate of the castle, they heard, and somebody was pounding on the gate of the castle. And the king turned to the queen, and what could that be? And the prince turned to the queen and said, what could that be? And the queen, of course, was the only one that really knew what was going on, turned to a servant and said, see to that. And the servant ran to the guardhouse, and the guardhouse sent out a soldier, and the soldier went to the steward, and the guard called the guard captain, and the guard captain and the steward all went to the gate, and opening up the small door in the gate, standing outside the gate, was a woman. Now, she was finely dressed, but she had been hard used by the storm. Her hair was all down in tangled mess over her face, and she was dripping wet, and her face was puffy and squinty. Clearly, she had been crying and quite afraid at some point. Her clothes were all splattered with mud and guck and who knows what from off of the street, and she was entirely alone. And the guard said, who are you and why are you here? And she identified herself as a princess from a neighboring kingdom who had become separated from her party because of the storm, and she was seeking shelter. Well, they had her just step inside the gate. They kept her in the gatehouse while the servant went and told the king and the queen what was happening. And immediately they came to the gate. And there's the king, and there's the queen, and of course, there's the prince. And they asked her again who she was. And again, she told them that she was Princess so-and-so from a neighboring kingdom. She had been out for the day having a wonderful ride with her retinue, with her ladies in waiting and her guards, and the storm had come in, and they were all soaked, and they were all separated, and then the thunder scared her horse, and the horse bucked and threw her off, and she may have been knocked unconscious for a while, and she staggered through the woods, and it was only the lantern over the gate of the castle that drew her to the safety of their home, and there she was, seeking hospitality and sanctuary, and of course, they welcomed her in. Well, the moment that the young lady said that she was a princess, the prince's ears kind of opened up wide and his eyes perked up a bit. And also the queen heard that she said she was a princess and was immediately suspicious, because any woman in a pretty dress could claim to be. But they welcomed her in and they brought her into the hall, and immediately arrangements were made to see to the princess. And fine linen towels were brought to dry her hair, and a long robe to cover her up that they should be warm. And they built up the fire a little bit, and they brought her a plate of their own very own dinner and a large cup of their very own wine. And while she was eating and resting and warming herself, the queen excused herself and said that she had things to see to. And she went to the guest chamber, and she instructed the servants to strip down the bed right down to the wooden foundation, pull off everything. And while the servants watched, the queen reached into her bag and pulled out one tiny little dry pea and laid it down on the foundation of the bed. And then she told her servants, bring a dozen of our finest sleeping mats and pile them up on top of the pea. And then bring a dozen of our finest eider-down comforters and make a beautiful nest for our visiting lady. Build the fire up, bring a jug of wine, do everything you can to make her comfortable. But everyone know this, not a word is said about the arrangements that we have made this night. And soon after that, the chamber was ready and the evening was coming to an end. And the queen herself escorted the young princess to her room, showed her the bed that she would sleep in. The princess was quite appreciative of such a wonderful looking bed, and the door was closed and the night passed. Well, the next morning, the king and the queen and the prince were at their table. They were breaking their fast, enjoying their breakfast, and the queen was waiting for the visitor to come out, because she knew in her heart of hearts that only a princess, through all of those sleeping mats and all of those soft comforters, only a woman who had been raised to enjoy the very best in life would ever feel anything to do with that pea under the mattress. Any woman that had been raised in a regular life, a common life, if you will, they would have found that bed luxurious. 12 fine sleeping mats and a dozen eider comforters. Only a princess would know the difference. So they waited, and it was a little later than they expected, but finally the woman came wandering in, and it was clear that she had had a very good night. Her eyes were baggy and her hair was disheveled, and she came to the table and she greeted them. Oh, good morning. Excuse me, good morning, your majesties. And she sat at the table, and they waited a time while she broke her fast. And then the queen looked at the young woman and she said, my dear, how are you this morning? I'm well, your majesty. Thank you so much for your hospitality. And tell me, dear, how did you sleep? And the princess, of course, she did not want to be discourteous, because she had been raised up to the very best of propriety. And she said, oh, your majesty, it was so gracious of you and your husband and your kind son to welcome me in out of the storm and give me a place of safety. And I do thank you for allowing me to spend the night. Now, the queen knew a bluff when she heard one. And she knew this princess was just being nice. And she says, well, yes, we were very happy to give you a safe place of rest, my dear. But please tell me, how did you sleep? And the princess paused for a minute, because, again, she didn't want to give offense. And she said, oh, your majesty, once I was safe, I felt so much better. And the room, you had a lovely fire in my room, and it was so warm. And I'm just so very, very grateful. The queen smiled a little bit and, okay, fine. And she said, well, that's lovely, dear. We're glad that you were safe. We're glad that you were warm. But really, tell me, how did you sleep? And the princess, again, she took a breath and she thought of how to say this. And she said, well, your majesty, of course, once I was safe and once I was warm, I mean, really, what more could I ask for? You provided a safe haven for me, and I'm so grateful. I'll be sure to tell my parents how nice you were. And the queen was, okay, well, thank you, young lady. That's good. We were happy to make you safe, and we're glad that you were warm, and they know that you were dry, and that's a wonderful thing. But tell me, dear, how did you sleep? And the princess said, your majesty, I am just overwhelmed by your generosity and your hospitality. The room was warm. I was safe. I was dry. You made a lovely bed for me, and I'm very, very grateful. And the queen was, yes, my dear. Yes, we understand that. And we're grateful that we were able to give you all those things. But tell me this, young woman, how did you sleep? And the princess realized that the gig was up. The queen was onto her, and she had to tell the truth. And taking a deep breath, she looked the queen right in the eye, and she said, your majesty, it was the worst night of my life. I saw all those sleep mats piled up, and I couldn't wait to crawl into that bed. And I saw all those beautiful eider-down comforters, and I thought it would be the most luxurious sleep of my life. But I tossed and turned all night. I feel battered and bruised and black and blue and beat up, and I just don't know what. I mean, it felt like I was sleeping on rocks. I mean, what is it with you people in this kingdom? How could you sleep on something like that? And once she started to rant, she couldn't stop. And as she started to talk, she saw the queen's eyes get wider and wider. and she saw her smile get brighter and brighter, and she realized something was not right here. And she stopped and she said, "Your Majesty, I'm sorry. Have I given offense?" And the queen said, "No, no, my dear, all is well. And I will tell you this, that surely only a woman raised to your status would have noticed that tiny little pea that I had placed under the mat. Surely you are what you say you are, and I don't know you well, but I would like to know more." Well, you will not be surprised to learn that a day or two later, they escorted the young lady back home. Messages were sent to let her family know that their daughter was safe. They escorted her back to her own castle. And by the turning of the season and the end of the year, the couple was betrothed, and both kingdoms knew that a celebration was in order. And that very coming spring, they met and they married and they began their lives together. And all because of a tiny little pea. The queen was assured that this young woman was exactly the right one for her darling son, the prince. And everyone was happy to attend the wedding to celebrate their marriage, knowing that they were meant to be together. And the prince and his princess, who met because of a pea, they all lived happily ever after. I do thank you for joining me today. Feel free to like it, share it, subscribe, do all those things. Feel free to buy me a coffee. I always appreciate that. The link's down below. We will see you in just about a week's time with a seasonally appropriate holiday type story. And until then, please take good care of yourselves and take care of each other. And we will see you soon. Cheers.